Hello everybody, and thank you for attending today's webinar on Community Liaison Officers. This is following IPECA's recent launch of some guidance and a toolkit for team building and management of Community Liaison Officers. My name is Rebecca Collicott. I'm Senior Manager for Sustainable Development at IPECA. And first of all, I'd like to welcome and thank our speakers, Claire Bebbington and Emma Wilson. They've been working with IPECA on developing this work, and you can find their bios on the webinar console. Just wanted to flag as well that if you would like to see the Community Liaison Officer work itself, there's a small icon at the bottom of your screens which looks like two chains linked together, and that will take you to the CLO suite of documents and guidance that we have available at the IPECA website. So before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. Also at the bottom of your screen, there's multiple application tools that you can use. All of the tools are resizable and movable, so you can feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or even maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them using the Q&A tool, and you can answer questions at any time, and we'll come back to them at the appropriate times in the webinar, so they'll just stack up, ready for question and answer sessions. We plan to divide this presentation into two sections. Firstly, on our research phase, and secondly, on the guidance and the toolkit. So we'll have opportunities for questions after each of these sections. And we will try and get to all questions during our webcast, but if you do need a fuller answer or if we run out of time, they can be answered later via email. We will also be using the poll function during this webinar, which should be self-explanatory, but we encourage you to participate and answer the questions for a very interactive experience. Also, for the best viewing experience, we recommend closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. So now I'm going to hand over to Claire and Emma for their presentation.
Thank you very much, Becky. This is Claire speaking, and to kick off the conference, I'd like to thank you all for dialing in this afternoon. I know everybody's very busy, and we'd like to know a little bit more about those who are listening in. So we have a poll question for you. If you could click on the icons on the screen to answer the question, have you ever been a CLO? So while you're doing that, I just wanted to say a few words from a personal perspective as to why Emma and I embarked on this piece of work nearly 2 years ago now. Some of you will know that just over a decade ago, I had the great privilege of spending 3 years in Azerbaijan and managing a team involved with the construction of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. And CLOs were part of that team. And it was striking to me how often, whenever we did lessons learned or reviews or looked at our performance in any way, how often the role of the CLO was talked about as being absolutely vital as an enabler of so much that we were trying to do. We also had an external scrutiny advisory panel who offered advice from time to time on who we should recruit as CLOs and what we should expect them to do. And all this was good stuff, but I had in the back of my mind the thought that when I was making decisions as the team leader, I didn't really know if the basis for my decision making was sound. So fast forward 10 years, Emma and I were having a conversation in a coffee shop, and we decided together to do something about this and to explore the role of the CLO as a vital interface as a vital part of the corporate community interface. So the poll results are now on screen. You are a much more balanced group of people than we had in the morning when only 20% of those dialing in were actually CLOs. One of the very important things to us is that CLOs have a voice. And we particularly welcome questions from those of you who have actually done this role during the course of the presentation. What we have been very, very pleased about is the degree to which the industry has responded to our work. There has been an acknowledgement that CLOs are poorly understood, excuse me, insufficiently supported, and a belief that their position in a company is actually underplayed. Now, IPECA's work aims to address some of that, and indeed is already doing so, as we'll explain later on the call. Some of what we were told was quite extreme. As you can see, the senior line managers believe that actually this was a failing on the part of the industry, and it's great to be part of an initiative that's seeking to address that. I will introduce our research and then hand over to Emma, who will go through some of the headline results. Our methodology was to begin this with a pilot project, which included a small online survey, a workshop, and a series of interviews with senior managers. We did this working in part with Leeds University as well, who were doing some particularly interesting work in Uganda. IPECA then took up the idea, fully supported by their members. We extended the survey, and we held a number of other senior manager interviews as well. The survey looked at a whole range of questions: who CLOs were, how they were employed, what they do, what their views of the job are, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to hand over to Emma now, who will take you through some of the findings.
Thank you, Claire, and hello everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is Emma Wilson speaking. So some of our results from the survey: we had 120 responses from CLOs from 25 companies across 31 countries, so quite a wide geographical spread. The majority of respondents were male and between the ages of 35 and 44. And it will be interesting to see how, whether you think that sort of correlates with your own experience in the industry. We do talk a little about identity later on, and if you do have any comments, please also feel free to add comments and as well as questions as we go along. So CLOs are more likely to be directly employed and full-time as opposed to on part-time contracts. Although job security was something that we did discuss with some people during the research. And they're also more likely to work over 10 miles from the community that they are working with, which is quite a distance. I mean, that's some CLOs do live within the community, but often there's quite a lot of travel to and from the community involved. So in terms of education, 93% of respondents had completed higher education, and 57% of respondents had been a CLO before. So as part of the research, we identified, this took quite a bit of analysis to identify 4 principal drivers that affect the role of the CLO. And this was responses from CLOs themselves, from managers, and from communities as well, because a certain amount of response from fieldwork. And so the first one on this figure is the project or asset itself. So what stage in the life cycle is the project at? Do the contractors have a particular track record? What are the stages of employment? And in particular, demanning could be an issue for CLOs. We might come back to that point later, but often if a project is downsizing, there are challenges for a CLO team, particularly at a time when maybe the CLOs need to be in place to address issues in the community. Impacts on land and the wider environment and the social fabric, these certainly require CLOs to be engaging with community members about those impacts. And financing, the financing of the project, who are the banks or institutions financing the project, what are their requirements, what kind of scrutiny and auditing do they carry out, and how are CLOs involved in those processes. We move on to the company itself. The company will have corporate strategy, a particular kind of corporate culture. What kind of leadership is there? To what extent are managers engaging in community issues, aware of community issues? Is communication good and open, and do people engage and openly talk about issues up and down the hierarchy, and policies, brand and reputation, the company track record and its reputation within the community. Maybe it's well known, maybe it's not known, and then shareholder interests of various different shareholders who may have influence. Societal impacts, local customs, norms and practices are obviously going to influence how the community liaison officer role is carried out, and what are the pressures and demands and so on. Sensitivities, the legislative and regulatory environment is going to affect how the job is carried out. National and local politics, whether a large and small p, are extremely important, and CLOs may find it difficult to keep out of local politics sometimes that may be a challenge to their work. And then international economic and political trends will be having an influence. And so you, the CLO, him or herself, what skills does the individual have, what kind of experience, and this may vary extremely between different people who are perhaps wanting to do the CLO role, and for managers there may be a limited number of or a limited range of skills available locally. So it's critical to understand what local skills and experience are, and who might be available to do this job, and how different people's experience and skills might be brought together in a team of complementary skills. What specialised knowledge and qualifications do people have, and what are their personal qualities? It's very important, the individual personal qualities, how they might be able to engage with the community, command respect within the community, engage well with their colleagues and with managers. And so they are also going to come with their existing relationships externally, and be building relationships internally, and all of those affect the way that the CLO carries out their job.
Thank you, Emma. Excuse me. There is a wealth of information from the survey. If anybody is interested in seeing a more complete summary of the results, there is an SPE conference paper, and please get in touch if you'd like to see that and struggle to find it. It was given in Abu Dhabi earlier this year. What I'd like to do now is to explore two themes briefly that emerged as a result of the survey. But before I look at the question of identity, I'm keen to find out your opinion about whether CLOs should come directly from the communities with which they work, or whether they should be based from outside the communities. So if you wouldn't mind pressing on the appropriate button on your screens, that would be great. By the way, there is no right or wrong answer on this. It's not a trick question. Again, slightly more evenly balanced than this morning. One thing that I think might be interesting for us to see whether we can establish is whether CLOs themselves on the call have strong opinions about this particular subject, and we'd love to hear from those who have been CLOs on this particular point. When we look at the survey results, we get a similar mixed pattern, a mixed set of views. We get a number of different responses, and when we have discussed this issue with CLOs, we have some very interesting and quite heated debates at times. Identities range across the spectrum. There are some people who feel that and who are native to the community with which they work, others who feel themselves as outsiders. But in some ways, the more interesting group is those that we have called the empathizers, people who do not identify closely to the communities with which they work, but they do feel some affinity to them, either through their nationality, shared values, shared histories, shared language, or because they have come to feel part of the community as a result of their work. There is another category heading in the other direction who feels more outside of the community once they become a CLO. They feel somewhat separate from it. And I think this issue is something that people designing and supporting community-facing teams need to take into consideration when they're looking at how they structure the teams and what they're expecting of their CLOs on a day-to-day basis. The next theme that I want to explore is one that I feel quite strongly about, and particularly having managed a team of CLOs, and that's the degree to which they face challenges in their roles. CLOs can be concerned about local corruption. They can be concerned about the behaviour of company staff in the communities, and many of them specifically mention the behaviour of contractor staff in the communities. CLOs, probably a higher number than this suggests, but are very concerned about being criticised by the community. And this plays out in some of the training that they felt they needed, which was how you manage those difficult conversations and how you manage that conflict. However, what I think should be particularly concerning for the oil and gas industry as a whole is the fact that nearly 1 in 10 of the CLOs that we've surveyed were concerned about threats made to them and their families. Anecdotally, we heard about CLOs who had been receiving threats of physical violence. And I suspect, given the feedback that we've had when we've begun to roll out the toolkit, that this may be a more extensive issue than even this suggests. That is now the end of our coverage of our research. Inevitably, given how short time we have, it's a very quick skip through what we found. As I said, a lot of this research is reflected in an SBE paper for those of you who are keen to find out more. But if anybody has any questions at this point, we'd be delighted to answer them on the research piece of work.
Yes, thanks. That was really, really interesting. Whistle through the extensive research that you've done. We have a couple of questions already, so if I could just kick off with an interesting one here. Have you found that there's a difference between the different countries in the research?
People expect that we do. People expect, I think, that there is going to be a difference between CLOs operating in a institutionally strong country with, established rule of law, etc., and those who are working in countries going through transitions or emerging from conflict. In fact, at the heart, there isn't. The qualities that CLOs value, respect of the community, honesty, and so on, are fairly common. What they do, as Emma will go on to talk about in terms of competencies, there are some common themes there. There's probably more in common than there is that's different. But we will stress, and this will come up time and time again, that the responding to local circumstance and to corporate and project drivers is really important. There's a common core, but there isn't a common complete job, which is a CLO role.
Yes, and I think every time the specific local context is extremely important, and even within the same country, the specific local context could be very different, and so you always need to be taking that into account. And also, it's worth emphasising that the toolkit has been developed not for north or south any country. It's not designed for a country with specific type of governance regime, but at the same time there may be additional challenges in countries, for instance, in a state of conflict, and that would need to be taken into account specifically over and above using the tools that are available here.
Very much. I've got another question here. It was mentioned that 93% of CLOs surveyed have completed higher education, which seems an impressively high number. Is completion of post-secondary education considered critical to CLO success in your view?
Perhaps I could just say something about the methodology there, because given that this was an online survey, I think although some companies did translate it, the majority of respondents responded in English. There is probably some bias towards a higher degree of education, or there may be a bias towards there being a higher response rate for this question because of the way the survey was used. I think if you look at what CLOs themselves value, these are the personal qualities are more important than educational attainment. Honesty, respect of the community scored highest out of the qualities that CLOs believed was important. Knowledge of the local culture was deemed to be important, but a good education was not really something that the CLOs themselves valued, and didn't really come up in the line manager interviews either, did it, as being something important?
Not as something essential, although CLOs that we've engaged with have clearly brought a lot of their education to the job when they have come from higher education backgrounds. But equally, people who haven't have got a lot of valuable experience, possibly largely local experience, that is extremely valuable. So I think there's a whole set of skills that complement one another in the job.
Great, thank you. Moving on to another question. This is something which I've thought of as well, actually. It's interesting to call out the finding that 1 in 10 of CLOs have received threats to them or their family, and that seems to be extremely important. How deeply has this been explored? And also, how do you get information about threats to CLOs? Because that does seem like a particularly delicate subject to broach.
I agree that it's delicate. I agree that it has to be handled with great sensitivity. I suspect there's also underreporting because in some places, not only do people not want to talk about it, but there may be a level of aggression that's expected anyway. You know, so that there may be a couple of issues playing out here. I think what has been interesting is the way in which this conversation has evolved and been developed by one of the companies that have piloted the training program, and the way in which simply bringing the CLOs themselves together and offering them a safe space to explore some of the challenges they face and to practice techniques in a safe space using role-playing and scenarios actually allows these sorts of issues to emerge in a very constructive way as part of a training experience. I think there's more work to be done. Was very encouraged at the last IPICA session when this was picked up by another company, and so I suspect that companies are going to think about this themselves. I think if this was an issue of safety on a operating plant, you know, if plant operators came to work and felt that doing their job resulted in, you know, potential personal harm, the industry would do something about it. So I think it is something that we should proceed carefully with and thoughtfully, but I think there is some good work going on, and I suspect that more will be done as a result of using particularly the training tool.
And I also think one thing that we emphasise in the professional development sort of part of the training is the need for an open and supportive environment for the CLOs to work within. And I mean, there's been a lot of talk in the UK and more widely about mental health issues in recent months and years, and I think understanding that side of a CLO's job is extremely important, to taking care of CLO's mental health and also being able to talk about issues that may be very, very sensitive and which they may not want to talk about and need a safe space, as Claire said, to be able to talk about.
So we've got a few more questions coming in. Were all of the CLOs you interviewed working for the company or for contractors? And is there a difference in the challenges faced depending on who CLOs work for?
The CLOs generally work directly for the company. We have flagged up the whole issue of contracted CLOs and the relationship between CLOs working in the field as being one that's worth exploring. I actually think there is another piece of research to be done, which is looking at this from the community perspective and trying to tease out what the communities see when they see company representatives coming in and how they perceive the role of the CLO working for an operating company versus contractor CLOs and field security officers and the people that interact with communities as part of a major construction project, certainly. But we haven't looked at that yet. I suspect that there are some commonalities, but I suspect also that there's some interesting nuances to be teased out there.
Another question here. With local corruption as a high concern, do you have any specific insights on managing that challenge?
One issue is again being able to talk about it. Another issue is, for instance, I've worked a lot in Russia where local corruption is a sort of way of working and operating, and it's very difficult to break through local patterns of practice. And so identifying what is corrupt practice and how to avoid it and how not to exacerbate it through project activities is something that you need to have a special sort of concern for and approach to and an understanding about what those challenges are. And obviously working with CLOs on issues related to personal integrity. How do you make sure that you know the boundaries, don't accept any bribes, and know some of the risk areas particularly as well, and ensuring that relations with local community members are made very clear and sort of any conflict of interest declared, that kind of thing. We found as part of the research, CLOs find it quite difficult to talk about ethical dilemmas, and that was one area that we wanted to sort of discuss with them. And so again, being very open about and encouraging discussion about ethical dilemmas is also an important aspect of managing the CLO team. Claire probably wants to add to that.
I'll add one observation from the workshop we did for the pilot phase was the importance of the CLO team leader in this as well. CLOs work in isolation. There's a kind of the downside to working in isolation for them personally, but there's also a downside to the company and the way in which they're managed, which is that of course they can assume quite a lot of power. And I think that a CLO team leader, that role is also a crucial one and one that we haven't really explored, but I think is an important one to get right. What we found is often a CLO team leader doesn't necessarily have skills in community engagement. For example, they can come from other parts of the company, which has both pros and cons. My own personal experience is there is stuff you can do. You can double up roles so that you don't put one person in a vulnerable position where they're vulnerable to inducement or subject to a malicious allegation. You can have distributed decision making where part of decision is part of the decision. Any decision on things that have a value, a monetary value or some other value, is taken outside of the CLO team itself. You can have separate financial and programmatic assurance, which is something we did in Azerbaijan, so that the impact of the program was assessed by one group and the financial performance was assessed by another group. So I think there are things that you can do, but I think it goes back to, do you support your CLOs in a way that enables them to raise these issues which results in supportive behaviour, and allows them actually to bring problems before they've become difficult things for everyone to face.
Great. So I think we'll just take a couple more questions on this section before we should move on to the toolkit. But another question here, did your research cover the opinion of CLOs about their job? Do they see it as a dead-end job?
That's a very interesting question. All the CLOs that I met think it's a fantastic job, and they were very excited by it. They found it very challenging, and you could tell there were frustrations, but particularly in the training when they were getting together and meeting one another, they were really stimulated and stimulating one another with their experiences. It may be very different if you find them at a period when they're alone and having to write a report and nobody seems to be listening to them. So, I mean, one other way of sort of interpreting the notion of a dead-end job is a job with no prospects for upgrading. And I think one or two people have mentioned in the survey the lack of prospects for career progression, exactly that. So that could be an issue, but that's one thing that we were hoping you could try to develop with the some of the tools that we're going to be talking about later, so we can talk about that. Yeah.
Great. So one final question, and then we will move into the discussion around the toolkit. So when the CLOs are part of communities, what is smart strategically? Is it better to allocate them to the project-affected communities? What are the pros and cons of having community members as part of the CLO team?
As part of that.
Strategic. Smart, strategic.
Well, I think that the people have different views on this very much. I think as we've sort of been exploring, it's really valuable to have CLOs who are part of the communities because of their knowledge, their existing relationships with communities, and so on. Sometimes there are challenges if there are political issues or if a CLO identifies with one part of the community and not another part of the community. So there are some challenges, and so there are pros and cons. And as the mini poll that we just had indicates, people are quite divided on the topic. And if you do have a CLO team, it is very good to have people from within the community as well as people from without the community to balance some of the issues and challenges. Language is always a key element, and so if there's a local community with a local language, it's very important to have CLOs who can speak that, or at least some CLOs within the team who can speak the local language. And Claire, other points?
I think I'd make a broader point about, we tend to think of communities as being those that are geographically specific rather than, say, what about women as a community group that isn't necessarily geographically specific, but should you have female CLOs if you want to communicate effectively with women in a particular community? Speaking from personal experience, the CLO with which I liaised when I was a member of a project-affected community was a woman from New Zealand, but she had won the respect of the local community and she was extremely effective. And to a certain extent, I think that community respect is the crucial point. It can be just as hard to win that if you're part of the community as it can be if you're outside. In some cases, it's easier to win if you're slightly removed. I think the crucial point is to know who you're hiring and then to address the pros and cons of those hiring choices consciously and not just think that you've sorted everything because you've gone one way or the other.
Okay, great. So let's move on to talk a bit more about the toolkit.
Great, thank you. So the toolkit is available on the IPECA website. There are various different tools. It was published in September of this year. The aim is to assist community relations managers in planning their teams, and it should be sort of considered and looked at before the managers start to plan their teams. That's the best time to be looking at it. It's also very useful, and certain tools are very useful for CLOs themselves in understanding their own role and understanding expectations, and also understanding some of the support that they might expect from the team and from the company. So the guidance material is it consists of a discussion section which highlights some of the key themes from our research and puts all of the tools and the guidance into context. And then the second part is a step-by-step guide which follows a sort of cyclical thing. The next slide. Or the next slide after that. It follows that figure, which gives the number of steps that you can follow during the recruitment and also the management of a CLO team. And then it follows round after the first cycle of review and feedback. As we make clear, you don't have to keep following this around in the same order, but it does emphasize that it's an iterative process and it encourages as much feedback as possible from the CLOs and from the community, and a constant reassessment and reevaluation of the local context and the four drivers that are affecting the role of the CLO. So to go back to the components of the toolkit, you have a list of community-facing responsibilities. These were developed through engagement with the managers and with the CLOs, talking about what responsibilities are important in engaging with communities. And we list those on the next slide, but I'll get to that. The competency framework designed, as I mentioned earlier, to help with job progression as well as to help with the development of job descriptions. The job descriptions themselves, there's some sample job descriptions for different levels. Again, in the next slide we go into that in a bit more detail. And then two planning type documents, one being the recruitment planner, which covers 5 key areas of the recruitment process. One is preparation, which is about understanding the context as much as anything, and does suggest that maybe a community relations advisor as a temporary hire might be a good idea in the early stages before hiring a permanent CLO team. The next section is advertising recruitment, and so it gives some ideas on how to advertise recruitment, be it through local radio, local newspapers, community bulletin boards, nomination by community leaders, and we cover the pros and cons of these different approaches. And of course, a recruitment plan could incorporate several different approaches. The other element is designing the interviews, and so there are several different methods for eliciting the kinds of skills and qualities of CLOs in an interview. So this includes presentation, analysis of a short article, explaining a basic procedure, stakeholder mapping exercise, a bit of role play if you want to have several CLOs brought in together to test out particular skills. So there's a range of different types of skill, and then interview follow-up, which is an important element, particularly if you are seeking to recruit from the community and you may have some disappointed candidates. And also one of the elements of follow-up would be to actually introduce the CLO to the community. The other tool is training and professional development. We've talked a bit about this, and so it gives some guidance on planning a training progression for a CLO, what might be required at particular times in the CLO career development, and also some guidance on the type of regular feedback you might want to do with a CLO. So next slide. All in all, the toolkit is flexible. It's flexible enough to respond to the different drivers that we've identified. It has been informed about what CLOs and managers have told us, and sometimes those things are quite different, and so it's interesting to see the sort of dynamic between those two. And obviously, it's just a basic sort of almost a skeleton of what you will need. They'll need to be further refined to respond to the availability of local talent, as you write here, but also the local context and various different particular challenges that you have identified in the project. And all in all, it's an iterative approach to creating these teams. Next slide. And next slide. So the job descriptions cover what we call core responsibilities, which we have identified as being common across all the CLOs. Then discretionary responsibilities, which are also critical, but may not always be performed by CLOs, either because it's not required for the project at all, for instance, if there's no resettlement required. Or sometimes these tasks are performed by another organisational group that is not the CLO. So we've just made sure that we've captured all of those responsibilities. And then there are general responsibilities that may be routinely required of CLOs, including support tasks and training. The JDs also cover personal attributes, skills, education and experience. And then the competencies in the competency framework, we go from level 1, which is awareness, and this applies to not only CLOs but also those managing CLOs and anyone related to the community engagement space. And we would expect, hopefully, this sort of awareness set of competencies to be included in other job descriptions and competency assessments. So level 2 is what we think of as basic application for a basic level CLO, and then you can bring that to more skillful application, which implies a job progression, and then level 4 would be expert. And the core responsibilities, which we think are common across the CLO role, include community insight, stakeholder mapping, information sharing, community engagement and community consultation, which are quite distinct, grievance and dispute management, crisis management, reporting and documentation, and then standards and scrutiny. And all of that can be seen in the documents and explored in more detail when you have more time.
Thanks, Emma. Just to close on the content of the toolkit, I want to talk a little bit about the training component. Emma and I have had the great pleasure of training a group of CLOs in Papua New Guinea, which has been, I don't know, one of my recent career highlights, I have to say. We have developed the training components as a series of modules. They relate back to the core responsibilities that Emma has just outlined, and they also respond to what CLOs and their line managers have told us. As with other components of the toolkit, this will get you 40% of the way in terms of it provides a core, basic and generic coverage of the modules that we outline here. But we do anticipate that to be effective, it needs a lot of adaptation and enhancement to reflect the local, societal, project and corporate context and the nature and experience of the CLOs themselves. We begin with an introduction to the role, drawing on our research. We've had some of our more interesting debates have happened during this module, particularly when we ask CLOs how they would define themselves as a bridge or a window, and that elicits some interesting differences of opinion. The stakeholder engagement and consultation module, I think, is probably very much what people would expect. The tools of engagement look at how you run meetings, things as basic as that, as well as more complex tools, and maybe there will be a question about social media at some point as well. We spend quite a lot of time dealing with difficult conversations, because this is the area that CLOs themselves told us they wanted greatest training and support in. And we have created and proposed a role-playing component to this module, again, because it allows CLOs to explore issues that they might otherwise find difficult to articulate. The meaningful reporting module is an interesting one. typically functional and line managers attach more importance to reporting than CLOs do. So we've designed a module that offers CLOs the opportunity to have a degree of ownership over how and what they report, and to share some of the outcomes of that with their managers. And finally, we look at standards and scrutiny, and this is particularly important to CLOs who work on projects and for companies where there's a high degree of external scrutiny, and that offers the trainers and managers the opportunity to put some of the requests that are made of them in context. So as a closing slide, we'd just like to reflect some of the feedback that IPECA members who have used the toolkit as early adopters have shared with us. We've been absolutely delighted with the feedback that we've had, and I think it's a great tribute to IPECA, the way in which that they've sort of encouraged and supported their member companies to use the module.
Yes, thanks.
Sorry, my voice is going.
Yes, thank you very much. I have to reiterate that it's been really well received, and I think the research has shown that this is a very important set of stakeholders. They're really at the front line of company projects and the operations, but they can often feel like a neglected set of stakeholders. So the feedback so far on this guidance and toolkit has been really great, and it's a really helpful framework for helping to formalise the role a little bit more and make people feel a little bit more valued in such an important position.
I think one thing that struck me about when we had the discussion with the IPECA working group is how well it fits, how well the tools fit with people's existing practices, and I think that's useful, and people can take what they need from it. And then things like the key competencies in this comment here, the framework has helped people to identify those elements, and raising issues that people really need to be looking at, and shining a light, for instance, on the issue of CLO safety. Some people have really appreciated that, and being able to trigger those conversations that they weren't having before. So yes, and the other point is it's saving time. So as Claire pointed out, we do have this. We do have the the 60-40 rule, which means that there's only about 40% of what you do in community relations can be prescribed by tools and guidance. But the CLO role is actually one of those roles that is constantly adapting and working with standards and guidance. And so it's particularly interesting that to do this work, because this is where things get adapted and created, and I think the toolkit can help people to do the training, get people together and do role plays, and really make standards and guidance meaningful.
Yes, thank you very much. So we now have an opportunity for a bit more question and answer on the guidance and toolkit. So I can see that we already have a question here to kick us off. Can you talk a bit about the link between CLOs and security teams within companies?
Well, I've had an interesting experience in Uzbekistan, where I'm working closely with a CLO doing a project audit on a regular basis. And one of the questions that came up was related to the security services. And the CLO just had no relationship whatsoever with the security services, and we found it very difficult to have discussions around the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And so some of those challenges are very, once you get to the sort of the actual project level, it's sometimes very difficult to start up the conversations, but it's actually useful to have things like the voluntary principles and to be able to sort of talk and engage a CLO in addressing some of these challenges and getting around being able to monitor what's happening at the perimeter of the project. So so the issue in Uzbekistan with the security services is the fact that they're state security services, and you just can't communicate with them. Even as a project CLO, you can't communicate with them. So I think some of those issues, CLOs and security. The other thing is, for instance, in Nigeria, you do have a huge problem with private security, and that's a whole different type of relationship. And projects do need to be grappling with that because security services are often having a direct relationship with the communities, and often it goes wrong. Sometimes it doesn't go wrong at all. But you need to be looking at that question, and I think it is very close to what the CLOs are doing, but it's sometimes quite difficult to explore it, in fact.
Okay, great, thank you. One other question here. What do you think about the roles of CLOs on compensation-related matters?
I'm not 100% clear about the meaning of this question, but I'm guessing that it's probably about land compensation or other forms of compensation paid to local communities. One thing that you hear a lot from CLOs is that they are only ever approached when things go wrong. And typically land acquisition, what we found in organisational structures is that CLOs can sit in several different places. But quite often the business, if you like, of acquiring land and the CLOs sit in different parts of an organisation. And wherever CLOs sit, it's really important that they have open and transparent and helpful access to what's going on in other parts of the team. So that lateral joining up, if you like, is really important. So I think CLOs are important in terms of land acquisition. I think because if it goes wrong, they will certainly be the people that are hearing about it and having to deal with the frustrations and anger that might result in that. But I think it sort of speaks to a broader point, which is CLOs carry a lot on their back. I think somebody used that phrase when we were talking to them, and involving them in issues which are impacting the community early when they have an opportunity to shape it and be heard, and their concerns are addressed is actually very important.
Thank you very much. We've got another question here about how can CLOs be promoted? If they're working on site, it can be hard to be visible and thus get promotion.
Mm-hmm. I think that cuts to the core of what we have been looking at, the visibility and being able to be appreciated, and for managers to understand what it is they're actually doing. And of course, if a CLO is very successful, then they won't hear anything from the community. So if they're not, if they're having problems, then there's a lot of noise. So it's very difficult to really understand how to assess good practice or good performance of a CLO. And I think part of what we're trying to do is to really ensure that what CLOs are doing is recognised, even if the result is a quiet community and everything happening perfectly as planned. That is a great sign of success, and you need to be able to recognise that. And in terms of promotion, yes, we're trying to develop a framework that allows for CLO promotion. I think one of the things we came across was where CLOs were saying we're expected to do a lot, and nobody's really understanding that we're doing all this stuff and it's not being recognised. So we're trying to, with the competency framework, we try to suggest that if a CLO is doing a certain level of work, it should be considered a next step up and an upgrade, requiring an upgrade. So it would be great to get people's feedback on whether that's successful or not. But the most important thing is being visible. And sorry to go on, but the other thing is reporting. So managers would be saying to us, oh yes, well the CLOs should be reporting on what they're doing. And then the CLOs are going, well, we're too busy doing what we're doing, and what do we know? How do we know what to report? And so, as Claire was saying, that one of the modules in the training does allow for CLOs to get a bit more involved in the nature of reporting, and so managers may understand and try to develop together with the CLOs a way of reporting that enables managers and others in the company to understand what's going on, and while not being overburdensome on CLOs, who still need to be making sure people understand what they're doing.
And I think the mismatch, one of the things we asked CLOs was to articulate their value. And although they undertake these amazing roles, which are really complex and involve negotiation skills, you know, a whole range of skills, when they're asked to judge what they think their value is, quite often they'll say delivery of a social investment project, which doesn't reflect the risks they manage and what they do. And I think I use the phrase, you know, really CLOs are managers of change, and if you start calling them that, you start seeing them in a different perspective, and they start being valued in a different perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So the next question is, do we need to have several CLO teams? For example, one for the company, one for the project, and one for the construction company. And if yes, how best to coordinate this?
Well, I think if you've got 3 sets of CLOs all working with the same community, good luck with that one. I think that you need to go back and look at what the corporate, project, societal context is, and then, from my point of view, design it from the community back into the company rather than design it from the company into the community. I think you may need different sorts of CLOs. I think you may need perhaps different organisational structures to cope with a major project. But I really do think, and I would love to do some research about this, that having several different or subtly different people representing the company and the project in slightly different ways, and then contractors on top of that, all liaising with the same community would be terribly confusing. So I would actually take a step back and look at the organisational structure and why you're doing that. And if you're doing it because people want their own group of CLOs within their own team, that's probably not a good reason. But without knowing the specific circumstance, it's quite difficult to give a one-size-fits-all answer.
I think we've got time for one final question. I guess it's in 2 parts. Firstly, why do you think there's been such a positive reaction to this work? And are there follow-on phases of research? And if so, what and where will you focus next?
I think one of the reasons for positive reactions is the practical nature of the research and the toolkit. And for us, it's been great to see that IPECA members have been using the tools straight away and getting back and talking about them. So that has been really good, and it is very practical. And we were talking about this earlier as well, the importance of having the people element to guidance, and we think it's probably going to be important to think about that for any kind of future guidance, to really be thinking about who's going to be implementing it, who are those teams, they need support, and really get to the heart of the actual implementation, because there's so much guidance out there. So I think that's made it particularly interesting as well. And also it has been a neglected area of analysis, and I think CLOs are very pleased to be the centre of attention and being able to talk about issues, having spaces created for coming together and talking. So I think that's another reason.
I think over the past 10 years there's been a real sort of sea change in the guidance available and the standards available and so on, and how comprehensive they are. But of course they're being adapted all the time, and the people doing the adapting are the CLOs. In terms of future research, well, Emma and I are particularly keen to do something on gender, looking at female CLOs and then looking at the CLO's experience liaising with female stakeholders, and we're also going to be looking at the impact of the age profile of CLOs as well.
Great. Well, sadly we've reached the end of our time, so first of all I just want to say a huge thanks to Claire and Emma, not only for this webinar today, but also for this work, which is really invaluable and, as you said, helping to serve a bit of a neglected part of our industry. Also, thanks to everyone on the line for your time and participation today and all the excellent questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to yours, but we will follow up later. I just wanted to point out that the CLO work can be found on the IPECA website, and it's free to download if you'd like to read in more detail. And also, we've recorded this webinar, and an on-demand version will be available tomorrow and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you before. IPECA members will be able to find the webinar on the Socially Responsible Resources page on the members area of our IPECA website if you would like to listen again or share with colleagues. And finally, if you have any follow-up questions for any of the speakers, do let us know. And many thanks to everybody again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you.